He was the strongest tank commander in the Soviet Union. With his T-34, he could hit any target precisely, every single time. He could tell what weapon destroyed a tank just by touching it. But a terrible incident left 99% of his body severely burned, yet, he didn't give up. His comrades rushed him to the field hospital while he was still breathing. The doctors, seeing his condition, doubted he'd survive the night. Surprisingly, half a month later, when the doctors came to check on him, they found his burns had miraculously healed. In 30 years of practice, the doctors hurried over to ask for his name, but he said he couldn't remember anything. Eventually, investigators found incomplete identity information inside his tank, revealing his name was Mark, a distinguished Soviet tank commander. Though he had recovered from the burns, he was suffering from temporary amnesia. According to regulations, he had to leave the front lines like other injured soldiers. However, with a powerful new German tank, the Warrior, decimating Soviet tanks wherever it appeared, and then disappearing into the forest, leaving heavy Soviet losses in its wake, they knew they needed a solution. According to the intelligence gathered, this new German tank had armor up to 250 mm thick, making Soviet shells feel like mere scratches. Meanwhile, the Warrior's cannon could destroy a Soviet tank in one shot. Facing such power imbalance, their usual attack methods wouldn't work. After much discussion, they decided to upgrade the armor and mobility of a T-34 to counter the Warrior, but who would pilot this upgraded tank? Eventually, the commanders found Mark. He was once an outstanding tank commander, and he had fought the Warrior before, though back then his tank lacked the armor to withstand the Warrior. Given his experience, the commanders chose him to pilot the upgraded T-34. Soon, they brought Mark to the area where the Warrior had last been sighted. Looking at the wrecked tanks on the battlefield, Mark concluded that the German tank must still be hiding in the forest. However, his commander stated that they had searched the area thoroughly the previous day. Mark, based on his experience, was certain it would emerge from the forest again. He decided to set an ambush and asked the commander to bring in another T-34. Though skeptical, the commander agreed. Trusting Mark for now, Mark hid his tank in a ditch, covering it with branches, and waited for the second tank. Once it arrived, he had it hide in the forest, prepared to lure the Warrior into the open where Mark could attack. To ambush the German Warrior tank, Mark drove the upgraded T-34 into a ditch, covering it completely with branches. He then had the second tank act as bait, hiding it in the forest. As the sun set, the Warrior finally emerged from the forest. It was the commander then fired back, instantly destroying the bait tank. Seeing this, Mark charged out of the ditch in his tank, adjusting his direction towards the Warrior. Upon reaching the target, Mark aimed his gun at the Warrior but missed the first shot. The loader quickly reloaded, and this time, they hit, but the Warrior's armor was too thick, especially near the bait tank. Meanwhile, the Warrior adjusted its firing angle and began blasting the bait tank. After enduring multiple hits, Mark decided they could no longer wait, they had to take the initiative. Mark's tank quickly charged towards the Warrior, but as they moved closer, the gun jammed in a mud pit, which went unnoticed amidst their haste. When they fired, the barrel burst open, enraging Mark as they lost their chance to destroy the Warrior. Seeing they were now weaponless, Mark exited the tank and began firing his pistol at the Warrior, which managed to escape. Despite the Warrior getting away, their confrontation proved it wasn't as invincible as most soldiers believe. After Mark and his crew charged out, he looked around through the scope, searching for the Warrior, but it was nowhere to be seen. He ordered the gunner to climb out and take a look. The gunner checked in 3 directions but didn't look behind them, where the Warrior was actually hiding. Once back inside, he reported that the Warrior was gone, but Mark wasn't convinced. He felt it was still nearby. Just as Mark suspected, the Warrior fired from behind, striking their tank. Fortunately, the upgraded armor held up, leaving them unscathed. Meanwhile, the commander, who was following the Warrior's tracks, arrived at a swamp and lost all trace of it. They concluded that the Warrior must have sunk into the swamp, so they stopped pursuing it. Soon after, a batch of new, upgraded T-34s arrived, all with enhanced armor and engines, but Mark was nowhere to be found. When they finally located him, he was kneeling alone, staring at the forest. The commander knew it was because of the Warrior and tried to convince him it was gone, trapped in the swamp. Mark, however, refused to believe it unless the Warrior was physically pulled out of the swamp. No amount of persuasion could change his mind. The commander decided to leave him be for the time being. Soon after, the Soviet forces launched an all-out attack on the Germans. Dozens of artillery and tanks fired at the German lines for over 10 minutes. After the barrage ended, the tanks, followed by soldiers, began advancing. As the top tank commander, Mark was, of course, leading the charge. They quickly broke through the German defenses, but suddenly, the long-lost warrior emerged from the forest once again. Those who knew tanks understood just how formidable the German Tiger tank, Warrior, was during World War II. Without hesitation, the Warrior opened fire, taking down its first target with a single shot, then continued, hitting every target precisely. Even when the T-34s fired back, they barely scratched it. The Warrior kept advancing, firing at will. If there were more warriors on the battlefield, the consequences would be unimaginable. Soviet tanks were destroyed like they were nothing, and some tank crew members were directly hit by the shells. The surviving soldiers screamed in terror, the scene beyond horrifying. Some were left in a daze from fear, while others were burned alive, reduced to charred remains. Despite the carnage, a few soldiers tried to retreat into the forest to hide. Mark, piloting his upgraded T-34, saw the Warrior about to retreat into the forest. He immediately pushed the tank to its limits, charging towards the Warrior, but arrived just a moment too late. The Warrior was already gone, but they didn't give up the chase this time. They followed its tracks to a village, knowing there was a risk of an ambush, but they pressed on without hesitation. They carefully searched every possible hiding spot along the way. After about 10 minutes, they came across a suspicious-looking old warehouse, just big enough to hide a tank. Mark immediately ordered the gunner to fire at the warehouse. To their surprise, a tank was indeed hidden inside, but it was a Panzer IV, not the Warrior. The Panzer IV turned and fired back at Mark's crew. Mark's tank fired back, destroying the Panzer IV with a single shot. But Mark wasn't pleased. He knew that the sound of the firefight would have alerted the Warrior. He was reluctant to continue advancing recklessly. They hadn't gone far when Mark suddenly stopped, scanning the surroundings. He didn't see the Warrior, but he had a gut feeling it was nearby. He ordered the tank to turn its turret, and as it did, they spotted the Warrior aiming right at them. The Warrior revved its engine aggressively. Mark knew they were in trouble and immediately moved the tank forward, just as the Warrior fired, narrowly missing them. They fired back, but missed again. Mark quickly drove the tank into a nearby building, with the Warrior's gun still tracking them. Once inside, they engaged in a close-quarters firefight. This time, they managed to hit the Warrior, though it wasn't a critical hit. Mark quickly backed out of the building, repeating the tactic, using structures as cover to weaken the impact of the shells, then attacking during the reload. Finally, they landed a successful hit, but it only disabled the Warrior's turret. Mark decided to close in to fire again. Unfortunately, while moving, the tank ran into a water-filled pit, and the barrel got stuck in the mud. Focused on charging forward, they didn't notice the gun was blocked. When they fired, the barrel exploded. Mark was furious. They had been so close to destroying the Warrior. But now they were without a functioning weapon, left with no other option. Mark climbed out of the tank, firing his pistol at the Warrior in desperation. Though the Warrior eventually escaped, their engagement had proven one thing: the Warrior was not as invincible as many believe.